Hello, and thank you for joining me once again for the latest installment of The Vault. My name is Julie Frey. I'm the curator at Hywet Hall & Gardens. We're going to continue today talking about FA and his post-departure from Goodyear and all of the ramifications that came from that decision. And this week's episode, we're going to talk about FA's personal finances and how kind of intrinsically they tied into Goodyear they were, and what a Herculean effort it took to extricate himself and kind of get back to a solid foundation with his personal finances. So when he left Goodyear in 1921, FA owed $6.7 million in personal debt, most of this comprising loans that he'd taken out in order to infuse Goodyear with cash during 1920 when he was trying to keep the company from falling into bankruptcy during that recession. This included $300,000 that he borrowed from his 6 children, and also almost $200,000 that he borrowed from his wife Gertrude. Most of the real estate that was in his name, which included properties in downtown Akron and farmlands in Ohio, Michigan, and Florida, were fully mortgaged at this point, again, to get a hold of as much cash as he could during 1920. In addition, he also owed Goodyear $3.7 million as a result of overdrafts on his corporate expense account. So this expense account was something that wasn't really talked about much, and it only showed up in a 1920 audit for the first time on the books of the company. And for that reason, many people felt this was a little maybe shady on FA's part, or why was this account something that hadn't been documented over all of those years of Goodyear's history. But if you think back 100 years, companies were run very differently, and FA really saw Goodyear as his company. He was the president, so I think he handled some of those decisions maybe a little differently than a company owner would today. But Goodyear wanted their money back, at the end of the day. In order to kind of compensate them, he had to put up some different things as collateral. So he had 125,000 shares of Goodyear stock. He put up 50% interest in the Akron, Canton, and Youngstown Railroad Company, and all of the bonds that he owned for the Midland Continental Railroad Company, which was a small rail line in North Dakota that FA had a controlling interest in since about 1916. So that was all put up as collateral. Goodyear held all of these materials in their possession. And the idea being that once FA was able to pay off that $3.7 million, he would get all that collateral back. So he still was one of the largest stock owners in Goodyear. And at that time, there were 2 types of stock in Goodyear. There was common stock, which FA was the largest stockholder of common stock, and something called preferred stock, which was a higher price point, but then it paid out a higher dividend. And it was very common back then, if you were a stockholder then as today. Sometimes it was monthly, sometimes now it's more common quarterly, that if your company is profitable, you receive a dividend check every month as a stockholder. So when Goodyear fell into the recession and was reorganized, they put a freeze on all stock dividends. They were trying to get the company back on its feet, get it back on sounder financial interests. So while FA was this huge stockholder, he was making no money on that stock. And that, of course, would have made a significant difference for his personal finances if he had been able to sell that stock or have the dividends available to him to use for some of these debts. And to manage a lot of this debt, FA created the Prudential Security and Realty Company. So they assumed all of the debts and all of the mortgages for him in 1921. So then on paper, FA did not look as if he had any debts. It was all owned by the Prudential Company, but FA, being the sole stockholder of that company, ultimately was financially responsible. And this was, of course, done because at the same time he was trying to start the Cyberling Rubber Company. So his financial sheet needed to look very clean in order that he could get new loans and things like that to start Cyberling Rubber. All throughout the 1920s, for about the next 5 or 6 years, this personal debt was a very crushing burden to him. He talks about it in letters all the time. But he finally, by about 1926, a way out kind of showed itself to him. So Goodyear began to turn a profit in the year 1926. It became the largest tire company in the world. It finally beat out the Goodrich Company. And it started to pay dividends for its preferred stockholders, but not the common stockholders. And people saw this as an inequality. If they're paying dividends for one, they should pay dividends for both. So FA was involved with a group of individuals to sue. They took Goodyear to court to compel them to start paying dividends to the common stockholders. So the case moved all the way through federal court and was eventually heard in Toledo in the spring of 1927. And ultimately the common stockholders won. They were successful. And the price of Goodyear common stock immediately doubled from $30 a share to $66 a share in 24 hours. So all of the common stockholders immediately saw this huge growth in their profits, FA's shares went from $4 million to over $8 million. And with that amount of money, he then could turn around and pay off all of the debts that had been haunting him now for 6 or 7 years. And that's exactly what he did. There's this very dramatic story they talk about where he went into a boardroom, divvied up all the money, and paid all the bankers and all the individuals who had loaned him money back in 1920. He was also able to give Goodyear their $3.7 million back and get some of that collateral back as well. The other effect of this lawsuit, which was very important, is it broke the stronghold of the New York banks on the Goodyear organization. So part of the lawsuit was that they had to expand the number of individuals on the board of directors. They had to have a certain number of individuals that were local. So the board at that point was largely controlled by New York bankers or financiers from other large cities. And that was busted for all intents and purposes. The new wider board had a wider array of businessmen and more local representation as well. So this was really seen as kind of the death knell for Dillon and Read and their takeover of Goodyear. So moving forward from 1927, not only was FA out of debt, but Dillon and Read were out of Goodyear finally. So thank you so much for joining me once again for the latest installment of The Vault. I look forward to sharing more with you again soon.